Of my resignation, it isn't really possible to be a proper backbench MP as a former Prime Minister.
And then he was gone. Cameron decides to abandon politics and leave the Brexit consequences behind him. Good evening. 15 years an MP, over 10 years a Tory leader, 6 years a Prime Minister. In March, David Cameron pledged he would stay as an MP even beyond 2020. In June, he said he would stay as Prime Minister. Today, broken by Brexit, it seems, he's left the political scene altogether. Hillary Clinton's campaign says she'll be back on her feet this week, but does her health scare take us one step closer to President Trump? The Battle of Orgreave. Was there a plan to mass-produce police statements about arrested minors? A former officer speaks out.
And I knew in my own mind that, that was wrong.
And Assad declares he'll take control of the whole of Syria as the ceasefire takes hold. So the former Prime Minister is to become a former MP. David Cameron has declared he'll be standing down from his Witney seat with immediate effect. The reality of modern politics, he said, meant life as a backbencher was no longer viable, and he would turn everything he did into a big distraction. Theresa May said she was proud to have served in his government, but Mr Cameron is likely to be remembered for the decision which cost him his job, the Brexit vote, which will take Britain out of the European Union. Here's our political editor, Gary Gibbon.
He'd said he wouldn't leave Number 10 even if he lost the referendum on Europe, but he did. And in his last appearance in the chamber as Prime Minister, David Cameron reassured those who pleaded with him to stick around and continue to give advice as a backbencher.
Can I ask that he will still be an active participant in this House as it faces a large number of problems over the next few years?
I will watch these exchanges from the backbenchers.
Or not. He tried out life as a backbench MP for precisely 10 sitting days in the Commons. This a rare sighting in the debate on Trident the week after he left Number 10.
I thought about this long and hard over the summer, and I've decided the right thing to do is to stand down as the Member of Parliament for Witney.
He was asked if Theresa May's decision to challenge so many of his policies, especially her decision to revive grammar schools, had triggered the resignation.
This decision has got nothing to do with any one individual issue, and the timing in that way, I promise, is coincidental. But it goes to a bigger picture, really, which is whatever the issue, as a former Prime Minister, being a backbench MP, I think it is difficult just not to be the distraction, the diversion, and therefore build a sort of reputation for yourself in politics that I don't really want to have. I wish her well. I wish the government well.
Justine Greening.
He quit on the very day the Education Secretary began the selling of Theresa May's push for grammar schools. In the Commons, many, but not all Tories, backed the move.
The whole focus of the debate so far has been on the question of admissions. But what makes for a good school is not how the pupils have been admitted, but on the quality of the leadership.
But will the Secretary of State confirm exactly how this proposal will prevent those that do not make the grade from being stigmatised and disincentivised?
Mr Michael Gove.
One of Mr Cameron's former allies, also languishing on the backbenches, was welcoming. But another former minister said, "We didn't lay into Justine Greening as it's clearly not her idea. It's a miscalculation by Theresa May, and it'll be diluted beyond recognition." But David Cameron won't be part of any rebellion. He'll be finding time for other pursuits. At 49, he insists he won't be retiring to a life of leisure.
In a moment, we'll be speaking with Ken Clarke. But first, Gary Gibbon is in Westminster. What's he going to do now, Mr Cameron?
He says he hasn't entirely decided, but he's given a few clues as to the way his thinking is working. He said he wants to carry on in some way in public service. He's had his name connected, of course, with the big society, the idea that he started with. I suspect he'd like to go back to that and show his commitment to it. And I could see him getting involved in a few charities, a few campaigns, perhaps, things that don't cross the path of his predecessor in a very specific policy way. I understand what he thinks is that in terms of ex-prime ministers, he may have matched Tony Blair in terms of leaving office virtually immediately and then leaving as an MP, but he doesn't see the Tony Blair retirement from politics as a template. He thinks it has besmirched Tony Blair's reputation considerably, and going out and looking like you're about raising money for yourself is not a very good image for an ex-politician.
And what lurks behind this? Brexit or May?
Well, I think you've got to give a bit of credit to one of the things David Cameron said. Being a great big beast on the back benches, you're about to talk to one of them now, but being as big as an ex-Prime Minister, the moment you raise your eyebrow, swallows or blink, people will interpret that as a move against the Prime Minister. In this case, there's an awful lot of stuff on the agenda where David Cameron probably does feel privately differently from the new Prime Minister. She, in some ways, is defining herself against him. So he didn't fancy that role, leading, as it were, seeming to lead rebellions against her. I think that is part of his thinking.
Gary Gibbon at Westminster. Ken Clarke, so do you think it's pure Brexit that's behind this, or do you think that it is the unravelling of his legacy, enshrined, of course, in the grammar school issue?
Well, let me say, first of all, I haven't a clue, because I'm as surprised as everybody else.
That's why I've got you.
He said in answer to my question he was going to carry on. I was very glad he was going to carry on. I was only told he would announce his retirement as I walked into the chamber this afternoon for the education statement. And so I don't know, and I think it's a great pity, because I think the House of Commons benefits if it does have some really senior people who've stayed in politics, alongside, obviously, the people you need, the new people, the people with the new ideas, people who are changing things. So I think he's obviously decided, no, it's not for him. I understand what he says, that nowadays everything he does is people are going to try to interpret it as some political message. And I hope presumably he's young enough, he'll find something else that he enjoys and have a fresh phase in his life.
But the interesting thing is that the May Premiership has started out charting a kind of new direction, and it's certainly not a Cameron-esque direction.
Well, firstly, it's saddled with the result of the referendum, so you're bound to have a rather abrupt change from the politics of the last 40 years, not just Cameron. And then they obviously thought of something that would change the subject from Europe, which has always been a pious hope of most prime ministers, and they leaked this grammar school thing by accident. So we've now got an awful lot of work to do on what's suddenly become the next focus of attention, a grammar school policy that, and actually it's already become a wider schools policy, and that needs a lot of work, because that's not quite ready yet.
Actually, as you know better than anybody, the grammar school issue, if you were ever going to bring them back, would require an educational revolution. And what are you going to do with those that are left out of it?
Well, one of the good things about this not very long consultation document, which I've now read, is it does try to widen it from grammar schools. I mean, somebody like me does hope we do not return to the awful, corny class war debates of the 1960s, all about grammar schools. Grammar schools...
Of course, you sound like a public school boy, but you are a grammar school boy, aren't you?
Yeah, I fooled the statisticians. I passed 11 plus. Nottingham City Council sent me to an independent school, so I was sometimes counted as a public school boy, but I was an impeccably 11 plus boy.
But you don't want to see it back.
That was one of the eras of social mobility. We've never had social mobility as the kind we had in the 50s in post-war England. But the downside was that the gulf between what happened to me, which transformed my life, and what happened to the vast majority of the rest of my classmates who went to, frankly, mostly dreadful secondary modern schools. There were good secondary moderns in some places, but I'm afraid there weren't for the inhabitants of Bourville and Nottingham. I mean, we can't replicate that. Now,
so you will continue to occupy your thorny place?
Yeah, but I'm trying to be constructive. I don't mind selection. Grammar schools, are very successful. The pupils do benefit. I benefited, but that's irrelevant. But in modern circumstances, if they took a decent proportion of people from poor households, then social mobility would be boosted. But there's far more to it than that. Yeah. You've got to make sure what happens to the rest,
right,
and what's the impact on the other schools. And the white paper or the green paper is a bit, open to suggestion on all that, but they're striving in the right direction, I think.
Ken Clarke, thank you very much indeed for coming in. Hillary Clinton's campaign team have admitted they could have handled yesterday's health episode better after it emerged that she's been diagnosed with pneumonia. They've promised to release more information about her health, insisting she will be back on the election trail later this week. But how far has it damaged her electability? Before all this happened, the Real Clear Politics poll average put Mrs. Clinton on 45.9%, with her Republican rival just behind on 42.9%. Now, that gives her the narrowest of leads, just 3 points. And instead of campaigning in California tonight, she's at home in Chappaqua. Not for security, journalists outside too, whilst for Mr. Trump, it's politics as usual. He's giving a speech in Baltimore. Our correspondent Kylie Morris is there. Kylie.
Well, there are some Trump protesters still here in Baltimore, but Donald Trump himself has left. He's finished speaking. Interestingly, in his address, he didn't mention Hillary Clinton's health directly. He has, though, in other forums today. What he did say we'll come back to in a moment. Hillary Clinton herself is resting and recovering, although we're told she could be out at events within the next few days. It is her campaign team, though, that is very much, I think, licking its wounds today. They're in clean-up mode. They've explained that they could have done better, that they should have acted more quickly to communicate the information that she had been diagnosed last week with pneumonia, and they've promised to release more medical records of hers this week.
She also lacks the mental and physical stamina to take on ISIS and all of the many adversaries we face.
It plays perfectly into the narrative her opponent has wielded against her. At first, her campaign explained Hillary Clinton became overheated at the 9/11 ceremony. She seemingly slumps and needs help into her van. She recovered swiftly, emerging from her daughter's apartment shortly afterwards, strolling into the sunshine, a picture of health.
Are you feeling better? Yes, thank you very much.
But by the evening, there was new detail. The campaign confirming that days earlier, she was diagnosed with a mild form of pneumonia. New facts to feed the rumours and theories that the former Secretary of State is hiding a serious health problem.
So go online and put down Hillary Clinton illness. Take a look at the videos for yourself.
A bad cough a week ago raised questions, but she took to late-night TV to laugh off any speculation.
This has become one of their themes. Here, you take my pulse while I'm talking to you.
Okay.
Make sure I'm alive.
Oh, my God, there's nothing there.
There's nothing there.
As for Donald Trump, he'll be the healthiest individual ever elected, according to his gastroenterologist. The Trump campaign's only attempt at providing health records, a rushed 4 paragraphs from Dr. Harold Bornstein, which the physician admits was written in 5 minutes while Trump's limo waited outside.
Proof I got 5 minutes to sit right at this desk and write that letter while the driver waited for me.
The Republican candidate says he takes no joy from Hillary Clinton's illness.
It's very interesting to see what is going on. I want her to get better. I want her to get out there. If you look at my scheduling and compare it to anybody else's scheduling, there's not a contest. So, I found the whole challenge to be very invigorating.
The challenge for Hillary Clinton's campaign now, how to recover without further invigorating her opponent.
Kylie joins us live from Baltimore now. He's just finished speaking, Donald Trump has. Any mention of that illness?
Well, John, no, he steered away from the health issue. Instead, he's desperately wanted to focus on comments that Hillary Clinton made on Friday, which potentially, I think, could be more effective for him in terms of winning voters. She made some comments which she has since apologized for in part, but those initial comments were that half of Trump's supporters belong to what she called a kind of basket of deplorables. They adhere to a basket of deplorables, her language. She talked about racism, about sexism, about misogyny, about homophobia, about xenophobia, thereby categorizing potentially millions of Americans as people who hold these bigoted views. Donald Trump's campaign wants to and has been hitting her very hard on that speech, saying that this is proof that she is a woman of privilege, that her campaign is an establishment campaign, and that she has very little respect for the lives of working Americans.
The disdain that Hillary Clinton expressed toward millions of decent Americans disqualifies her from public service. You cannot run for president if you have such contempt in your heart for the American voter, and she does.
I mentioned that Hillary Clinton did in part apologize for those comments. She said that she mistakenly was being kind of grossly generalistic, but she also reserved the right to call out bigotry where she sees it. I can imagine we will see those comments played over and over by the Trump campaign in the weeks ahead.
Kylie Morris in Baltimore. Now, the former head of police standards of one of the country's largest forces has heavily criticised police strategy over arrest statements during the Orgreave miners' protest in 1984. Mike Freeman, who was a police constable on the front line at Orgreave, has spoken out for the first time, telling this programme he was told the statements would be written by other officers, something he says that was simply wrong. Tomorrow, campaigners are due to meet the Home Secretary to renew their call for a public inquiry. Our chief correspondent, Alex Thompson, has this.
It was hot on June the 18th, 1984. The Orgreave coking plant in South Yorkshire. The biggest confrontation of miners and police in the entire strike.
I've never seen as many police officers on one operation in such a small confined area that I have seen to this day. So yeah, clearly there was some very, very high level planning that went into that operation.
Now a Labour councillor in Greater Manchester, Mike Freeman was face to face with the strikers at Orgreave. Tonight, for the first time, he explains the operational orders Manchester officers were under as they were bussed over the Pennines that day.
If you arrest a prisoner, you will take that prisoner back to a prisoner reception area. You'll be given a reference number, you will return to the lines. And at the end of the operation, you will return to the prisoner reception area where there'll be a statement waiting for you to sign.
That's incredible. What did you make of that?
Well, I knew in my own mind that, you know, that was wrong. And I can clearly remember saying to colleagues that I was with that day, I will not be making an arrest on this operation, and I didn't.
Mike Freeman had recently policed the Moss Side riots. He knew how it worked. He knew this went against the fundamental of policing. The officer who makes the arrest writes the statement. When he got to Orgreave, this is what he saw.
When we arrived, I distinctly remember that the South Yorkshire officers were wearing flat caps with orange headbands, and they were called logistics. And it surprised me, what's this logistics? And what sticks in my mind is the briefing that we were given and passed down through our public order command chains.
And for years he's wondered if this was part of that order to mass-produce statements. Those who've campaigned for 4 years now for an inquiry into Orgreave in London today. Tomorrow they meet the Home Secretary.
It's shocking, isn't it? And really, really disappointing. But I'm not surprised. I mean, the Hillsborough disaster showed the length of cover-up over 27 years and showed the material was stored all over the place.
95 miners were arrested at Orgreave, but the subsequent trials all collapsed through lack of evidence.
Over the years, it's become apparent that clearly all the prosecutions did fail, and they failed for the very reason that it would appear that the statements that were made or were signed by officers were not the statements that they made.
Mike Freeman's ready and willing to repeat all of this under oath to any inquiry. Channel 4 News has also obtained secret cabinet documents which show the then Prime Minister and key cabinet ministers putting the police under pressure to get convictions after Orgreave. Margaret Thatcher told one cabinet meeting she wanted the government to pursue vigorously all possible means of accelerating the prosecution of alleged offences. Her then Home Secretary, Liam Britton, complained at another of the lack of progress on trials and that he'll persuade the police to speed up prosecutions. The Orgreave plant is long since demolished, but it leaves unfinished business. The Police and Crime Commissioner for South Yorkshire wants an inquiry. The Independent Police Complaints Commission wants an inquiry. And South Yorkshire Police themselves want an inquiry. Telling this programme,
the Hillsborough inquests brought into sharp focus the need to understand and confront the past and give people the opportunity to explore the circumstances of such significant events. South Yorkshire Police would welcome an appropriate independent assessment of Orgreave.
Orgreave, then Hillsborough 5 years on. Same police force, some of the same commanding officers. Similar allegations of manufacturing evidence and conspiring to pervert the course of justice on a massive scale. South Yorkshire Police are under investigation for just that over Hillsborough, but not Orgreave. Not yet.
Alex Thompson reporting. To Syria now, a ceasefire has begun, with the army promising it will be applied across the country for 7 days. President Bashar al-Assad vowed to take back control of the whole country as he celebrated the Muslim holiday of Eid. He's in Daraya, now back under regime control. So far, rebel groups have agreed to stick with the truce. Our Foreign Affairs correspondent, Jonathan Rugman, is with me. Too early to say whether it's holding?
It isn't holding. It does have the heft of the Russians and the Americans behind it, which should bode well, but the situation on the ground is so complicated. We're already hearing of multiple violations, including a helicopter dropping canisters over rebel-held Aleppo, 4 Syrian government soldiers reported killed in Daraa in the south. I think the issue for Aleppo is whether 30 aid trucks, now on the Turkish side of the border, will be allowed to get through to rebel-held areas of the city. The Russians say they can go ahead. We'll have to see what happens there. But President Assad didn't even talk about a ceasefire today. He's still talking about wiping out all terrorist groups. And I think the problem will be getting all the rebels to agree to it and getting the Syrian government not to respond to any violations.
Jonathan Rugman. Almost 50 people have been wounded in a car bomb attack by suspected Kurdish militants in southeast Turkey, a day after 24 mayors were removed from office for alleged links to a Kurdish terror group. The move by President Erdogan and his regime is just the latest use of the emergency powers brought in after July's failed coup attempt. They bombed Parliament with F-16s. 240 civilians died defending liberty, but elements of the Turkish military failed to overthrow President Erdogan. Democracy won, or so it seemed. Because what's followed since July's failed coup has not looked much like democracy to Western eyes. But in the last 2 months, more than 80,000 people have been arrested, sacked or suspended, all enacted under a state of emergency that Erdogan declared. His critics say that political freedom is under threat. Many journalists say they've been treated as the enemy within and falsely accused of sympathizing with the US-based cleric Fethullah Gulen, accused by Erdogan of orchestrating the coup. And yet, for a so-called autocrat, Erdogan remains hugely popular, after his more secular predecessors left many Turks feeling largely ignored. Well, earlier I spoke with the award-winning author and journalist Ece Temucuran, once fired for criticising the Turkish government. And I began by asking her, what's it like being a writer in Turkey today?
Exhausting. I'm not being a writer only, but living a normal life is quite exhausting. We have been subjected to traumas constantly for the last few years, especially. So living that is already very tiring, but writing about it is even more so, I guess.
Sense of why it's hard? Because you don't know whether what you're going to say is going to have you locked up or what?
Pretty much so. And then it's not only the oppression from the government, but also the society has changed in the last decade. So people like me wouldn't be considered as the first-class citizens of this new regime, this new Turkey, as they call it. So we are kind of remnants of the old regime where secular Turkey was the big plan.
But the new Turkey is an Islamic Turkey.
I think like people are, focusing on this Islamic side a lot. I know that, and I've been, criticizing the creeping conservatism and so on and so forth. But I guess the most important thing here is not being Islamist, is not being conservative. It is more like being obedient. I try to tell it in the book as well, because there are those people who are Islamists, who are Muslims, who are practicing Muslims. There are people who are conservatives, but they're not, dancing to the tune of the political power.
So what are we left with?
We're left with a polarized society, pretty much so. And, and the polars of this society is not only hating each other, but also I think they are disgusted by each other now. AKP supporters and the others. I mean, the society is pretty much split like this, and I think We moved from hatred to disgust even. They don't want to see each other. They don't want to live with each other. But by saying that, I might be committing a crime, complaining about my country. So I'm not really comfortable talking about that.
No,
but the main, emotion people like me are having is they are not really wanted in this new project, which is called New Turkey.
But Erdogan himself is more popular today than he's ever been. But you could argue that actually Erdogan is exactly what Turkish people want, a democratically elected tough guy.
Oh yeah. Speaking of that, I think it's a trend in the planet, not only in Turkey. And we have Putin, we have Trump, we have you have Boris Johnson, and so on and so forth. This is a trend. This is a new trend. They call orderism, I think, and it's getting along. I think we are going through a big crisis of democracy, and maybe Turkey is a good case to represent. It's a symbol. It might be becoming the symbol of that crisis.
The Turkish author Ece Temilkaran talking to me earlier. On now, day 5 of the Paralympics in Rio, and Britain has celebrated 2 more gold medals. It follows yesterday's unprecedented haul for Britain of 21 medals in just 24 hours. Will Bailey took the gold in the men's class 7 table tennis, going 1 better than the silver medal at London 2012. The 28-year-old beat Brazil's Israel Pereira Stroh 3-1 in the final. And there was a new Paralympic record for Welshman Aled Davies as he took the gold in the F42 shot put throwing more than a metre clear of his nearest rival. Britain now lies second in the medal table behind China with 58 medals, 25 of them gold. You can watch it all on tonight's live Paralympics on Channel 4 straight after this programme. That's all we've got time for. That's Channel 4 News. Good evening.